This teaching is on the purpose of fasting, and I'm basing myself on 2 Samuel chapter 12. Fasting is something that Christians do. We find it in the Old Testament, we find it in the New Testament, and so I thought it'd be important for us to understand the purpose of fasting. Welcome to Equipped. I'm Dr. Mario Escobedo. This channel is designed for people who have, as part of their ministry, the responsibility of equipping others. So maybe you're a pastor, Sunday school teacher, you teach a Bible study, something to that effect. You have the responsibility of equipping other believers. This channel is for you, and it's to help equip you so that you can continue carrying out your ministry of equipping others. If you're new here, thank you very much for checking this out. I hope you consider subscribing. So let's jump into the teaching. Again, the purpose of fasting, basing myself on 2 Samuel chapter 12. Now, this is a story of David, and I'm going to get into the story in just a little bit, but let me start from the beginning, telling you what I think the purpose of fasting is, whether it's in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, whether we're doing it today, regardless of why you're fasting or what you're fasting for. Here's the big idea of this teaching. Here's what I think the purpose of fasting is. And here we go. The purpose of fasting is to align your will to God's will. I think if you boil down the teachings of fastings in the Old and the New Testament, and even throughout church history, I think this is a good, solid understanding of what the purpose of fasting is. It's to align your will to God's will. Now, there's at least a couple of reasons why we shouldn't fast. I'm sure there are a ton more, but I'm going to share with you just two reasons very quickly why I think you should not fast, or reasons why you shouldn't fast. Because the purpose of fasting is not so God will give you what you want. When you do that, it ends up being more of a hunger strike. You're trying to manipulate God, convince God, get God to give you what you want. And when you're doing that, you're not trying to align your will to God's will. You're trying to align God's will to your will. It's backwards. It's not an appropriate reason to fast. It becomes a hunger strike. I'm not going to eat until. I'm going to stop eating until you do, until you answer, until. And if that's your primary motivation or reason for fasting, I don't think that's a correct reason. The other thing, this is a bit more comical, but I have heard some people put fasting in this type of context. Fasting, the purpose of fasting is not to lose weight. Now, maybe that's an additional benefit or side effect of fasting, but I have heard of people saying something to the effect of, I'm going to fast and, I might lose a little bit of weight. And you kind of get the sense that the real reason they're fasting is more to lose weight than to align themselves to God's will. So in this teaching, what I'm going to tease out from the scripture that we're going to look at, 2 Samuel chapter 12, is that the purpose of fasting is to align your will to God's will. Now, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, this is where David has an affair, commits adultery with Bathsheba. Let's get just a little bit of context before we read some of the passage. We find out that he slept with a woman who was not his wife. This was Bathsheba. And I think you probably know the story. His army was at war. He stayed back home, and then that's when the adultery took place. The woman, Bathsheba, she became pregnant as a result of that adultery. And then David had Bathsheba's husband killed in order to hide what he had done. After all of that took place, then we find out that the prophet Nathan told David that the baby that Bathsheba was going to have, that baby was going to die. And sure enough, we find out that the baby became very ill. So after all this chain of events, and you can read a lot of that in 2 Samuel 11 and then 2 Samuel 12, here's where we're going to get into the idea of fasting. When David finds out that the baby is ill, the prophet prophesied that, and then David finds out that the baby became sick. Here's how David responds to the news of his baby being sick. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 16. It says like this: David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted, that's what we're talking about, he fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. Okay, now let me point out some things here. Some things that we probably have to extrapolate that aren't explicitly stated in the text, but I think they're reasonable for us to come to these conclusions. All right, first of all, David is fasting. And even though it doesn't say it explicitly why David was fasting, the context is that his child is very ill. And add to that he heard the prophecy from the prophet Nathan that his child was going to die. So I think it's reasonable for us to infer that the reason David was fasting is because he wanted God to heal his child. I mean, that was the focus, the emphasis of his fasting and his praying, that he wanted God to heal his child. He wanted God to intervene miraculously in this situation. Here was a situation that only God could reverse, only God could do something. And so David is fasting because he wants God to intervene miraculously in this situation. To me, David's fast demonstrates his commitment to see a divine intervention in this situation. It's almost as if David is saying, I'm giving up my most basic need as a human, the need to eat, so that I can focus all my attention, all my energy, all my time to praying and fasting and showing God just how serious I am about him answering this prayer. And I think symbolically speaking, David might have even been saying something to this effect. This is so important to me that I'm willing to die of hunger to see God intervene. Now, I say that symbolically. That's not in the text, but I say that symbolically. I think that might be one of the implications of fasting, that you're demonstrating how serious and this need is to you, that you're even willing to give up food. And so fasting, we discover from this passage here, it's incredibly appropriate. It is extremely appropriate. It is okay to fast whenever there is a dire situation that you're encountering, be it in your own physical body, on behalf of somebody else, anything that requires your absolute and undivided attention, a massive need that you have. It's appropriate to fast in those situations. Now, let's look at what happened as a result of David's fasting. We're going to keep reading. We're going to go on to verse 18. We read 16 and 17. David is fasting, giving all of his attention, all of his energy, so that God could intervene miraculously and heal his child. Look at what happens in verse 18. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. Verse 19. David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He's dead. When you get to this point right here, again, David had been fasting, asking God for a divine intervention to heal his child, and then you get to these verses 18 and 19, and we discovered that the child died. So your immediate response might be something like, the fasting failed. I mean, it didn't work. And you might even jump to the conclusion, David didn't fast long enough, David didn't pray hard enough, David didn't have enough faith. So you might jump to the conclusion and say the fasting failed, and then I just kind of have to ask, did it? Did it really fail? Because, again, the purpose of fasting is to align your will to God's will. And I think what we're going to discover is that even after David didn't get what he was fasting for, what was more important was that his heart be aligned to God's will, that his will be aligned to God's will. And I think we discovered that that is exactly what took place. Here's why I say this. Look at verse number 20. After he finds out that the child died, then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, look at what he did. He went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request, they served him food, and he ate. Now, here's where I want to focus, where it says he got up, he did all that stuff, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Now, here's where I say that I see that David's will aligned to God's will. Because what you don't see in verse 20, David's reaction was not one of getting upset with the Lord. David didn't demand to know why his fast didn't work or result into what he wanted. David didn't say, I'm done with this. You didn't give me what I wanted. I even fasted. I even gave up food, and you didn't give me what I wanted. That wasn't David's response in the least. David's response was that after he didn't get what he was fasting for, afterwards, he went into the house of the Lord and he worshiped. I have to believe that during that time that he was worshiping, and by all indications it was 7 days, that during that time of fasting and praying, the Lord was working in David's heart so that his heart would be aligned to God's heart. The Lord was working on David. David, through that period of fasting and praying, was drawing closer to God. And sure, he started off wanting his child to be healed, but little by little, I have to believe that the Spirit of God was working in David's heart so that little by little, David was becoming more and more and more aligned with God's heart and with God's will. So that by the time this happens, that his child passes away, David doesn't go into this hysterical fit or dive into a deep depression. He gets up and he went to the house of the Lord and he worshiped. This is what demonstrates to me that David's heart was aligned to God's heart, that David's will was aligned to God's will because of the way that he responded to the fact that he didn't get what he was fasting for. So during that time of fasting, his heart became aligned to God's heart, to God's will. And I think David may have recognized that the point of fasting wasn't to change God's mind, it was to change his heart. There was nothing wrong with David fasting for the reason he was fasting. He wanted God to intervene. Nothing wrong with that. But I think in that period of fasting, David discovered that it was much more important to align his heart to God's heart, not trying to change God's mind or trying to change God's will. And so we discovered that this is how David reacts. This to me demonstrates that David understood the reason I'm fasting. Maybe I didn't start off knowing that at the start of the fast, but at the end of this fast, I discovered God spoke to me in that period of fasting to let me know that it's all about aligning my heart to his heart, aligning my will to his will. There's incredible application here for us today. And again, if you have the ministry responsibility of equipping others, of equipping other believers, there might be some people in your small group, in your Sunday school class, in your congregation who are encountering very difficult situations, and their response might be, I'm going to fast. And they might have the notion in their mind that the reason I'm going to fast is so that God will respond to what I want, or the way I want, so that God will give me what I need, what I'm asking for. And again, I don't want to suggest that there's anything wrong with that. David did exactly that. But here is an incredible opportunity for you and for me as equippers to help people see that the purpose of fasting is to align your will to God's will. Let the people see, look, you may not understand everything that's taking place. And I just want to prepare you that if things don't go, if God doesn't answer the way you want him to answer, it doesn't mean that you failed in your fast. It doesn't mean that you cheated on your fast and that's why God didn't answer, or that you didn't have enough faith and that's why God didn't answer, or you didn't pray hard enough or long enough. It doesn't mean any of that. The purpose of the fast is so that your will would be aligned to God's will. I think there's a lot of pressure on people who are going through a fast, who want to fast, because they feel as if this is the secret weapon. I mean, this is it. And no doubt, fasting is such an important and powerful tool. But I think it's important and powerful when it's used appropriately and when we understand that it's in order to align our will to God's will. And so there may be people over whom you exercise your ministry and your leadership who have an incorrect understanding of fasting, and here's an opportunity for you to teach them and to show them, listen, when you begin this fast, understand that God wants to work on your heart. Understand that what you need to be crying out to God for, in addition to the situation you're praying and fasting for, is God, align my heart to your heart. Align my will to your will. Allow me during this period of fasting to allow my heart to be aligned to yours and my will to be aligned to yours. I think that's a much better place to be and a much better reason to fast instead of, I want you to give me what I want. Because at the end of the day, look, this is what it all comes down to. It has nothing to do with what we want. It has nothing to do with us. It has to do with God's purposes, God's will, God's plan, and advancing God's kingdom on this earth. That is the need that overrides absolutely everything else that's going on in our lives. Not to say that the things we're going through are unimportant, not at all. But above everything is God's purposes, God's will, God's kingdom and advancing that kingdom and the role we have in advancing God's kingdom on this earth. So very important to take David's example, and especially this part right here, that after the fast, when he didn't get what he was fasting and praying for, he went into the house of the Lord and he worshiped. He thanked God. He worshiped, even though he didn't get what he was asking for. That's incredible to me. And it demonstrates to me that David's heart was aligned to God's heart. David's will was aligned to God's will. So to wrap this up, once again, the purpose of fasting is to align your will to God's will. And again, if you have the opportunity to share this with your small group, your Sunday school class, your congregation, do this so that people have a good understanding of what the purpose of fasting is. You may be leading a congregation-wide time of fasting. Maybe this is a good opportunity to teach this or prepare a sermon on this so that people will understand, why is it that we're fasting? Well, because on an individual level, we want our will to be aligned to God's will. But at a corporate, at a body level, as our church, we also want our will to be aligned with God's will. I hope this has been beneficial to you. I hope this has helped equip you just a little bit more so that you can continue equipping others. Again, thank you for joining me. Consider subscribing. Just tap on that subscribe button, tap on the bell icon so that you receive notifications anytime I put out a new teaching. Thank you very much for joining me. God bless.